Okay, we want to do chapter 11. This is a chapter titled Towards Meaningful Translation. And before watching this video, you should read the entire chapter. Read it and study it from pages 80 to 87. And a Bible translator is somebody who knows the Bible, but also the culture of the Bible. I want two volunteers to come. Mwilu, if you'd come quickly, and Moyo, come quickly. I want you to stand here. Bring your books with you. And I want you to take your book. Let me hold it for you like this. You are going to read very out loud these two paragraphs, okay? And the rest of you just listen, and you, later, I will ask you to read on this page. But go ahead and read that page out loud.
One of those who found some of the buried money was Joan Beja. They arrived with it at night at his house, and he did copy for it that night at his house at Sokoban. Yes, it was at his house where he did copy for it. The next morning, as they were eating the head, the new jawbone fell down, and it was not tilted when it fell, but rather it was upright and it was pointing east. When the old woman saw it, they said, "Do it a second time." Perhaps they have regarded it as insufficient. And yes, Joan did copy for it a second time.
Thank you. All right, I want to ask Rebecca, do you know what copy is?
No.
Okay. Blessing, do you know what copy is?
No.
Okay. Let me ask you another question. Somebody who has not studied the book. I think those two, the rest of you have studied the book, but these two have not studied the book. So, Rebecca, what was the, what was it that fell down?
Hmm?
What fell down? Something fell in the story.
I don't know.
Okay, it says it was a bone. Wasn't it a bone? Yeah, a jawbone. The new jawbone fell down. What is the meaning of that, Rebecca, when the new jawbone falls down?
Jawbone. Chirezo.
The jawbone, no, it was not a jawbone of a person, but it was a jawbone
Of something.
if something in the story fell on the ground. What was the meaning of that?
I just heard that a jawbone fell, but I don't know from which animal,
You don't know what it
being.
means, right?
No.
You don't know what it means.
No.
So this is a story, this is an actual story that was written down by somebody, but they wrote it down for their own people. Their own people would understand everything in the story. There's a lot of things in here that they know everything. They know what copy is. They know what type of meat they were eating. They know what it means when that jawbone would fall like that, and what they had to do a second time. It says they had to do it a second time. What was they had to do a second time? Do you know, Treasure, what was it they had to do a second time? The story is very confusing because there's a lot of what we call implied information. Okay, there's information here that is implied. Now we're going to read the story a second time. Moyo, I want you to read it out loud and clear. This time especially those like Rebecca and Blessing and the trader. Listen to the story and see if you can understand more of it.
One of those who found some of the buried money was Joan Beja. They brought it to his house at night, and he celebrated the feast of Kapi with a pig as payment to the ancestral spirits. Yes, it was at his house there in Salakoban that he celebrated the feast of Kapi for it. The next morning, as they were having the traditional community breakfast following feast, the jawbone of the pig that had been sacrificed the previous evening fell down from the eaves of the house where it was traditionally hung. And it was not tilted when it fell, but rather it was upright, and it was pointing east where the ancestral spirits are said to live. When the old woman saw it, they regarded it as a bad omen and said, "Celebrate Kapi a second time. Perhaps the ancestral spirits have regarded the pig you have sacrificed insufficient payment."
It's insufficient payment.
As insufficient payment. And yes, Joan celebrated Kapi for a second time.
Okay, so the second story, thank you, you can sit down. The second story adds in the information that a person from that culture would not understand. It says here that they celebrated the feast of Kapi, which Kapi is a feast that they celebrate. They give a pig to the ancestral spirits. I asked what Kapi was. Rebecca didn't know what Kapi was. But they added into this translation that information which now explained what Kapi is. It's a payment, it's a sacrifice they make to the ancestors. And then it explains more in the story here, in this translation. When they sacrifice that pig, they take the head of that pig and they hang it inside the building. Whoever hung it there, they didn't tie it well. And it fell. And the way it fell, it was pointing towards the east. And now it says the women saw that and they said, "You need to do it again." What was it they need to do again? The sacrifice. They need to do the sacrifice again. So, and yes, Juan did the sacrifice of Kapi a second time. So the second version of the story has the implied information added into it. If you're not from that culture, you won't understand it. You miss the point of the story. And that's what this chapter is about. So the question is, how much information can a translator add into the Bible translation? You are translating the Bible, and some of the things you're translating, it's not included in there. For example, this morning I gave the example of the necklace. Okay? We read the story of the wedding proposal. Well, I told you about a wedding proposal. In America, you might give a ring. But in the Bible times, they would tie 10 coins together. And the woman that lost a coin, she lost one of the coins from her necklace. And it would be an embarrassment to her. Maybe even the wedding is off because she lost that coin. Now, the question is, can I add that information in? Or is it really necessary to add that information in for people to understand the story? What do you think? Yes or no? Can you understand the story without adding the information that this was a wedding, something used for a wedding? Mushabati, what do you think?
I think you would look at the author. Since the author decided to have that information hidden, when we translate also we'll try to keep it the way it was. We try to be as original as possible.
Okay, you're missing the point of this lesson then. Because this lesson is saying that the local authors of the Bible, they wrote their Bible story, they understood things in the culture. They didn't always add it in. Our job as translators is now to add in that information. Okay? So, Mushabati, I don't think you're missing the point of this chapter. Or I think you're missing the point of this chapter, that there are some things that are written in stories. To be a good translator, you must add in that information. So then I asked the question, how much information do we add in? That's the question. How much information do we add in? And then my question was, for this story of the lost coin, it was in the Gospel of John, the lost coin, is it necessary to have this information to appreciate the story? And I'm going to give the answer, no. Most Bible translations you look at, they don't add in this information. You will get that information from looking at a Bible, background notes, commentaries, other research books. But you can still appreciate the story of the lost coin, because all of us, whether we have it's a silver coin, we know it's valuable. Even if you lose any coin, maybe for some reason, you want to find it. But this brings out, if you knew the background, this brings out even more importance. This was not just a coin, but this was her wedding. So it does help. But most Bible translations will not add in that information. Okay. So the question is, Doc, I want you to stay in front of me, not on the side, please. You have to come around. Stay on this side over here so you can move. Just stay right there, yeah. Okay, now move back. Thank you. Thank you. So you have to stay, you can't add information in that also that did not exist at that time. For example, at that time, you wouldn't add information about maize. Where did maize come from? Maize comes from Mexico. It originated in Mexico in Central America, that part of the world. And when the voyagers first traveled in the 1500s, 1600s, they traveled to the New World, America, and that was the first time they saw maize. And they didn't know what it was, but they learned what it was. The people there were growing it, and then it began to spread around the world, and it came to Zambia, and now we eat nshima like it was always here. But your ancestors did not eat maize. They ate sorghum and some other things, but they did not have maize. So you can't put maize, if you want to write about the history of Zambia, in maybe the ancient ancestors, you would not put that they were eating nshima made from maize. You would be inaccurate. Maize probably came here much later. All right? So the same way with the Bible. You can't add in information that did not exist at that time. Let's say you want to say Jesus went from Jericho to Jerusalem. He was riding on a bicycle. You can't do that because bicycles did not exist at that time. So when you add the information in, you have to be historically accurate. Another example is, let me ask the question, when in the Garden of Eden, what was the fruit that was growing on that tree that Eve took it and gave it to Adam? What was the fruit? Do you know what fruit it was?
Just known as the fruit, we don't know what kind of it is.
Okay, we don't know what kind of fruit it was. Some people think it was an apple, but I can tell you it was not an apple. Because apples also came from the New World. They came from America, the land that I live in. They grow very nice apples there because that's where apples originated. Now apples have spread around the world. They can grow them in South Africa, maybe Zimbabwe. They grow apples in different places. You can grow them in Zambia, but they don't grow very well. But you can't say in the Bible that Eve took an apple and gave it to her husband, Eve, or Adam, because apples were not in that part of the world at that time, as far as we know. I mean, we don't know exactly what was in the Garden of Eden, but you would be probably historically inaccurate. Look on page 82 of your book. The important thing is that a translator is faithful to the historical text, okay? This is you have to balance two things. Two things you have to struggle with as a translator. One is you have to be accurate. That's faithfulness to the historical text. And secondly, you have to communicate. That's being natural, okay? So sometimes these two things, accuracy and naturalness, they want to compete. Okay? Be careful, you're trying to be natural and you lose accuracy. Accuracy must always be maintained. We talk about explicit and implicit information. Okay? Explicit is things that are openly stated. Okay? We took the example of the Gospel of John this morning where Jesus told the parable of lost coin. It was stated it was a woman. It was stated it was a coin. It was stated that it was a silver coin. And of course that she lost it. All of those things are in there. But the implicit information is information that is not included. Why do they not include that information? Okay, that's what we're going to talk about now. Why would a writer not include information? There are 5 reasons. I've written them on the board. They're also in your book. One is that the people of that culture, they know it. Okay? This man who wrote the story on the first page of this chapter about copy, he doesn't need to explain about copy to the people who are listening to him, because everybody in that culture knows copy. So if he fills up space talking about it, they would not appreciate him. They would, for different reasons. So people understood it. A second reason is that it's clear from the context. It's clear from the context. Let me give you an example of this. There's an example here in the book when there's a woman who's cooking and she says to the child, I, or no. She just says no. And people, if you read that story, if you put the whole thing into a story, they know what the mother meant. She meant, don't put your hand in the fire. You could even make it more explicit. Do not put your left hand now into the fire. But it would be ridiculous to say that. Whether it's left hand or right hand, it's ridiculous. Okay? You could even make it more explicit. Don't put your right hand into the bottom of the fire because it will burn you. You know, you don't need, all this information is just, you understand it, it's implied. So the situation may require it. And especially that situation where it's an emergency, the child could get burned, you just say, no. And people understand. It's understood. The last reason is to focus on something else. The example given here is that many times in the Gospel of John, the writer of the Gospel of John says, the disciple whom Jesus loved. It would say that the disciple whom Jesus loved asked Jesus a question. Rather than saying his name, I asked Jesus a question, or John asked Jesus a question. He used the phrase, the disciple whom Jesus loved asked Jesus a question. Why did he do that? Maybe he wanted to keep the focus on Jesus in the story and not upon himself. We don't know why, all the reasons. Thank you. So, let's look on the top of page 85. On page 85, there's an important question. See, at the top of page 85, number 7, it says, is it permissible to make some implicit information explicit in a translation? The answer to that is yes. You need to add information. If you don't add in the information, the translation is bad. When Mwilu read his story about copy, okay? That would be a bad translation for people in Zambia. Because this story came from the Philippines. In the Philippines, it may be, okay, that's a good translation. But for Zambia, this translation of making the sacrifice, the pig's bone fell on the ground, that would be a bad translation. Why? Because it's confusing. A good translation should not confuse people. That's why we say clear. The translation should be clear. People understand what is the purpose of this. So when you translate the Bible into your language, people should read it, they should know what it's saying. It should be clear. That's why in the second time, this translation, it added a lot of information in. And you can see that they added information in, they put it in italics. Okay, italics is a special font. You can see it there in your book on the top of page 81, the italics. That all the things that are in italics are the added information. But it's actually a good translation. So the answer is yes, you can add in information to your translation. But you need to keep this in mind. Remember who you are translating it for. Okay? Remember who you are translating it for. You don't need to translate things so clear for the Tokolea people in the Bible when their culture in the villages is actually closer to the culture the culture of the Tokolea people in the villages is actually closer to the culture of the New Testament. So many things we do in Tokolea villages, way we farming, the way we get our water, transport, using ox cart, okay? Those types of things, very similar to the way Bible times. If you go to a different place, there are some places in the world where they live very differently from the Bible, then you may need to add more information in. For example, we have in the very far north of North America some very cold regions, just snow all the time. Snow and ice. Maybe 2 or 3 months of the year there's no snow. The culture there is very different than the Bible. So there a translator may want to add in information. At the bottom of page 85 there's an important box there. It says the translator needs to keep the people for whom he is translating constantly in mind. That's why you need to know the culture of the people you're translating for. And you need to study chapter 10 and chapter 13 about understanding the culture of the people. Let's look on the top of page 86. We only have a few pages to go. The top of page 86, these are the guidelines for adding in information. Okay? Number 1, it says only information that is already implicit in the original text may be made explicit. No new information may be added. You cannot add information into the Bible. It says in the book of Revelation that if you add information, the last chapter, chapter 22 of Revelation, it says if you do not add information into this book. It also says in the book of Deuteronomy, do not add information, do not take away information. But when you make something implicit, explicit, that is not adding information. You're just bringing out things that are already implied. Number 2, implicit information may be made explicit under the following conditions. Number 1, if it is essential. It has to be essential in order to communicate the main point of the message. The example we gave of the lost coin is probably not essential that people understand that it was a wedding, part of a wedding proposal type thing. So the translators didn't add it in. But if it is essential, then you need to add it in. Let me give the example I may have mentioned before. Bread in the Congo. When Jesus said, I am the bread of life. To the Jewish people, that was their staple food. That was their nshima. They ate bread every day. They didn't eat nshima, but they had bread every day. Bread in the morning, bread at lunch, bread in the evening. If you go into the Congo, where I lived in the Congo, there was no bread. We buy bread, it comes from Uganda, maybe then before that it came from Kenya, and by the time you get that sack of flour, it's got all these insects in it. And we'd still bring them out, and my wife would still try to bake. But the people in the villages, they would never eat bread. Maybe once a year they would go and buy something bread. So at Christmas time, they said, we're eating bread. So if you translate, I am the bread of life, what is the implicit information? I am the bread of life. What is implicit there? The implicit information is the knowledge that this is their staple food. This is the food they eat every day. So you can add that information into your translation. In the Congo, you might put a footnote and put at the bottom, bread is what the people ate every day in the land of Israel. That would be a way to add in the information. There's other ways to do that as well. Letter B, under 2, it says if there would be no meaning, the wrong meaning, or would be communicated. Sometimes you do a Bible translation and people look at it and they don't even understand why it has no meaning to them. Maybe you need to add in some implied information that would help them to understand. I don't think any of the Tokolea people or the people of your language would appreciate this story about copy. They would just look at it and say, I don't have time for foolishness. When they get your Bible translation, are they going to look at it and really appreciate it, or are they going to say, I don't have time for foolishness, I don't understand it? So your job as translators is to bring out any implied information so that people can appreciate the meaning of the text. Letter C. It can be done without distorting the main focus of the message. You don't want to add in so much implicit information that people lose the focus. You're adding in all these things and adding this, and then people get confused as well. And the last one, D, if it is appropriate to the original situation in which the message was given. Number 8, how much implicit information should be made explicit? You must judge the level of understanding of your people. Some areas you go in Africa, people are very well taught about the Bible. They understand these things, they understand the wedding coins, they understand about bread. The pastors have been there and they taught them. People have been to Bible school, they know these things. Other places you go, in some places in parts of Africa or the world, even South America, even in America, some people, they're becoming Bible illiterate. They haven't heard the Bible stories before. So you need, for those situations, you need to add in the information. So you judge the level of understanding of your people. The last point, on that page, on page 86, number 9, you must be faithful to the scriptures. You cannot make them inaccurate when you add information in. Okay, it's important. And on page 87, number 10, it says making explicit information implicit. It may be necessary. It may sometimes be necessary to leave information that is explicit in the source text, implicit in the translation. Usually this is to avoid unnatural redundancy in the receptor language. The important point is always to make sure that there is no loss of information in the translation, and also that the same degree of emphasis and emotional impact is maintained. There may be times when you say we can actually omit something in the Greek language because people understand it in the translation, and if we keep it in there, it will sound awkward or strange to them. So that's the end of this lesson. If you did not understand anything,